A man in Boston paid for her like property, so she ran, answered a six-line advertisement in a newspaper, rode 3 days on a borrowed mule, and arrived on a mountain where a man twice her size looked at her and said, "You won't last a week." 4 months later, she was running into a burning building to save everything they had. This is her story. The barn was already gone by the time she turned around. Not dying, not smoldering, gone. The kind of fire that doesn't negotiate. Flames tore through the timber frame like something living, something hungry, throwing orange light across the mountainside until the trees themselves looked like they were bleeding. Smoke rolled thick and black against the autumn sky, blotting out the stars one by one, and somewhere inside that roaring inferno, the horses were screaming. Silas Hadley stood on the porch of his cabin with blood running down his left arm. The rifle in his right hand was still warm. Behind him, Boone sat against the doorframe, clutching his ribs, each breath a shallow, broken thing that sounded like paper tearing. Wyatt was already moving toward the barn, pulling his shirt over his mouth, shouting commands that the fire swallowed whole. And Clara Hadley, who 4 months ago had never held an axe, never fired a weapon, never slept a single night without four walls and a locked door between her and the world. Clara was running straight into the flames, not away, into. She came out 30 seconds later, dragging the leather trunk that held every tanned hide they owned. Their income for the winter, their survival packed into 60 pounds of stitched deerskin. The sleeve of her dress was singed black, and there was a burn across her forearm that would leave a scar she would carry for the rest of her life. But the trunk was out. The hides were saved. She dropped it at the foot of the porch steps and looked at Silas. Soot on her face, ash in her hair, eyes steady in a way that would have been impossible 4 months ago. "They'll come back," she said. Silas nodded. His gaze didn't leave the tree line where the shadows moved. "I know, and next time they won't just burn the barn." Before we continue, tell me where you're watching from and hit subscribe for more stories like this. The woman standing in that firelight was not the woman who arrived on a mule in the spring. That woman was afraid of wolves. This woman ran into burning buildings. That woman couldn't split a log. This woman could shoot a tin can off a fence post from 30 meters. That woman had white hands that had never known a callus. This woman had scars on her palms and powder residue under her fingernails and a spine forged from 4 months of living on a mountain that did not forgive weakness. But to understand how a virgin bride from Boston ended up standing in firelight on Blue Ridge Mountain beside three men who had changed her forever, we need to go back. 4 months back to a newspaper advertisement and the most reckless decision she ever made. 4 months earlier, Clara Whitfield had never sat on the back of a mule before that Tuesday in May. And the mule, a stubborn creature with opinions about every rock and root on the trail, had never carried anyone as slight as she was. Both of them wanted to turn around, but neither of them had anywhere to turn back to. She had been riding for 3 days. 3 days on coaches that rattled her teeth loose one night, in a way station that smelled of tobacco, spit, and kerosene, and now this final stretch up the mountain on a borrowed mule led by a boy from the town of Ashford who charged her 50 cents and did not speak a single word the entire climb. Her white dress was brown with mud by the second day. Her Boston shoes, thin-soled and meant for parlor floors, had split at the toe on the first morning. She had blisters on both hands from gripping the reins, and blisters on the insides of her thighs from the saddle, and a bruise along her hip from when the mule stumbled, crossing a creek bed, and nearly threw her into the water. But her back was straight. That was her mother's training. Margaret Whitfield had spent 24 years teaching her daughter that a lady's posture was the last thing to break long after her spirit had already given way. Clara hated the lesson, but she kept her back straight anyway because right now spine was all she had left. In her dress pocket, folded and refolded so many times the creases had turned soft as cloth, was a clipping from the Boston Evening Transcript. 6 lines of type. The words that had brought her here. Seeking a wife. Hard-working, not afraid of difficulty. Honest man, owns land, owns home. Will not promise an easy life. Will promise never to abandon. She had read those 6 lines 40 times on the train. She had memorized them by the second day. And she had built in the private theater of her imagination a picture of the man who wrote them. Rough, perhaps. Unpolished, certainly. But decent, capable. The kind of man who said what he meant and built things that lasted. What she had not imagined was this. The cabin sat on a shelf of rock halfway up the western face of Blue Ridge. It was small, perhaps 4 rooms built from logs that had darkened with age until they looked like iron. The roof was cedar shake, patched in places, smoke curling from a stone chimney. Around it, a clearing of packed dirt and cut stumps where the forest had been pushed back just far enough to give a man a clear line of sight in every direction. There was a barn behind it, solid but plain, a garden plot to the south, a wood pile against the west wall stacked higher than Clara's head, and the door was opening. The man who stepped through it stood 6 feet 4 in boots that had seen more miles than most horses. His hair was dark, threaded with gray at the temples, and his face had the kind of weathering that doesn't come from age alone. 49 years he had lived, but every year on this mountain counted double. The lines around his eyes were deep carved by sun and wind and things seen that could not be unseen. His jaw was heavy, shadowed with stubble, and his hands, the first thing Clara noticed, were enormous. Scarred, calloused in layers, holding an axe that still had sap on the blade because he had been splitting wood when she arrived. He looked at her, took in the mud-stained dress, the broken shoes, the white-knuckled grip on the reins, the rigid posture that was holding her upright through sheer will. His expression did not change. It was the face of a man who had stopped being surprised by anything a long time ago. "You're the one from Boston," he said, not a question. Clara nodded. "You won't last a week up here." He said it the way a man states the weather, not cruel, just factual. And Clara, who had traveled 3 days to hear those words, who had spent every cent she had on coaches and mules and way stations, who had left behind the only city she had ever known to stand on a mountain where the air was so thin it hurt to breathe, looked up at him and said the first thing that came to her mouth. "I went 3 days alone to get here. I'm not going back. You give me a chance or I build my own cabin." She did not know where those words came from. She had never spoken like that to anyone, let alone a stranger twice her size who held an axe. But something about the mountain air, or the exhaustion, or the raw fact that she had nothing left to lose, pulled the words out of a place inside her she didn't know existed. Behind Silas, 2 more men appeared. The first came from around the corner of the cabin. He was bigger than Silas, which Clara had not thought possible. Broader in the shoulders, thicker in the arms, with a face that stopped her breath. A scar ran from his left temple down to his jaw, a long, ragged line that pulled the skin tight and twisted his expression into something that looked like permanent anger. But his hands held a bundle of freshly picked herbs, the stems still wet, and something about that detail, this scarred giant cradling wild mint and chamomile, made Clara look twice. The second man emerged from the tree line carrying a rifle slung across his shoulders and a string of rabbits in one hand. He was leaner than the other two, sharp-featured with quick eyes that moved constantly, reading the world the way some men read books. He was chewing a stem of grass, and when he saw Clara, he grinned. "I bet you $5 she doesn't make it 3 days," he said to the big man. The big man did not laugh. He was looking at Clara's hands, at the blisters in the raw skin, and something shifted in his expression. Not softness exactly, more like recognition. Silas Hadley set down the axe. He looked at Clara for a long moment, measuring, calculating. Then he spoke. "1 week. You prove you can survive 1 week on this mountain. Work, cook, endure. If you're still here after 7 days, I keep my word. Marriage like the advertisement says. If not, I send you down to Ashford and you find your own way." Clara slid off the mule. Her legs nearly buckled. Every muscle she owned was screaming. But she stood, back straight, mother's training. 1 week, she agreed. And that was how Clara Whitfield, age 24, daughter of a Boston book printer, and a woman who believed virtue was measured in silence and obedience, came to stand on a mountain in North Carolina with 3 men she did not know and a future she could not begin to imagine. She did not know that the scarred man was Boone Hadley Silas's older brother, 52 years old, who had not spoken more than 10 words to a woman since the war. She did not know that the lean man with the rifle was Wyatt Crane, 47, who had been orphaned at 8, enlisted at 15 by lying about his age, and considered the Hadley brothers the only family he had ever had. She did not know that all 3 men had fought in the Civil War, that they carried wounds both visible and invisible, that the mountain they lived on was the only place in the world where the noise inside their heads went quiet. And she certainly did not know that somewhere in the town of Ashford, at the foot of this mountain, a man named Thomas Greer was already writing a letter to his employer in New York. A letter that mentioned the Hadley property, 800 acres of old-growth oak, and the words, "last holdout will require pressure." But the ground beneath them had already begun to shift. That first night, Clara lay on a straw mattress in the smallest room of the cabin, the only room with its own door. Silas had given it to her without being asked, the way a man clears a path without thinking about it. The three men slept in the main room on the other side of the thin plank wall, and Clara could hear them breathing. The deep, even rhythm of men who had learned to sleep in any condition, because war had taught them that rest was never guaranteed. Outside, the wolves began to howl. Not distant, close. Close enough that Clara could feel the sound in her chest, a low vibration that bypassed her ears and went straight to the part of her brain that remembered being prey. She pulled the blanket tighter, pressed her back against the wall, and tried to breathe the way her mother had taught her. Slow and steady, controlled, ladylike. It did not help. The wolves were not interested in ladylike. Then she heard footsteps, heavy, deliberate, on the other side of her door. Not a wolf, a man. The handle moved, the door opened just enough, and in the thin light from the dying fire in the main room she saw Silas's silhouette. He did not enter, did not speak. He placed something on the floor just inside her door, then pulled it shut again. His footsteps retreated. Clara waited until she was sure he was gone before she reached down. Her fingers found cold steel, a pistol, loaded, placed where she could reach it from the bed. She had never held a gun in her life. The weight of it was shocking, heavier than she expected, dense with a purpose that had nothing to do with decoration or politeness or any of the things she had been raised to value. She did not know how to fire it, did not know how to check if the safety was engaged, did not even know if it had a safety. But she understood the message. It wasn't "I'll protect you." It was something else entirely, something no man in Boston had ever communicated. It was, "Here is the power to protect yourself. I trust you with it." She set the pistol on the mattress beside her pillow, and for the first time since leaving Boston, she slept. Silas Hadley did not sleep that night. He sat on the floor outside Clara's door, with his rifle across his knees, and listened to the wolves until they moved on. Boone found him there in the morning, stiff-backed and red-eyed, and said nothing about it. But later that day, when Wyatt asked if the girl from Boston was going to make it, Boone said something he had not said about anyone in a very long time. Maybe. The first 3 days were a catastrophe of good intentions. Clara tried to cook. In Boston, she had used a cast-iron stove with adjustable dampers and a kettle that whistled when the water was ready. On the mountain, cooking meant an open fire that did whatever it pleased, a cast-iron skillet that weighed more than her arm, and ingredients that had to be identified, gathered, cleaned, and prepared from scratch, because there was no market, no grocer, no convenient anything. Her bread burned black on the first attempt, and the second. Her coffee tasted like mud. Her attempt at stew produced a gray liquid that even Wyatt, who would eat anything, looked at with genuine concern. Boone ate every bite without a word, just sat at the table with his scarred face bent over the plate, chewing with the steady determination of a man who had eaten worse things in worse places and would not insult effort with complaint. Silas pushed his plate aside after 2 bites and cooked his own meal. Not with anger, just with the efficiency of a man who had been feeding himself for 20 years and saw no reason to change now. Clara bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted blood. She would not cry. Not in front of them, not in front of anyone. Her mother's voice echoed in her head. A lady endures without complaint. Clara had always hated that voice, but for the first time she understood it differently. Not endure to be pleasant. Endure because you chose to be here. By the 3rd day, Boone began to teach her, not with words, with presence. He stood at the fire in the morning and baked cornbread slowly, deliberately, while Clara watched from the table. He did not tell her what he was doing. He just did it in a way that could be followed, adjusting the coals, testing the heat with the back of his hand, checking the bread by smell rather than sight. When the bread came out golden and fragrant, he set it on the table and walked away. Clara made her next loaf the same way. It was imperfect, slightly dense on one side, but it was edible. Boone ate 2 pieces. Wyatt taught her to split wood, not because the men needed her to do it. Between the 3 of them, they had enough firewood to survive 2 winters. He taught her because he saw something in her eyes on the second morning, a desperate need to be useful to contribute something other than burnt bread and good intentions. Don't use your arms, he told her, positioning her in front of a chopping block. Arms get tired, use the drop. Let the axe do the work. Raise it up, guide it down. Gravity does the rest. She missed the first 12 swings. 13 through 20 glanced off the side. On the 21st, the log split clean down the middle, and the two halves fell apart like they had been waiting for permission. Clara looked down at her hands. They were raw, blistered, weeping in places. Her shoulders ached, her back burned, and she was smiling. The first real smile since she arrived on this mountain. Not polite, not practiced, not the kind of smile her mother had coached for dinner parties. A smile that started somewhere deep and broke across her face before she could stop it. Wyatt saw it. He did not comment, but that night around the fire he told Boone and Silas, "She might surprise us." Silas said nothing. He was watching Clara across the room where she sat mending a tear in her dress with a needle and thread she had brought from Boston. Her stitches were invisible. Perfect. The hands that could not swing an axe 2 days ago moved with absolute precision over fabric, and Silas found himself watching the way her fingers worked, quick and certain, as if this one skill, this one competence, was the foundation she was building everything else on top of. He did not realize he had been watching for 20 minutes until Boone cleared his throat. On the 5th day the mountain tested her, Clara was at the creek washing clothes. The water was cold enough to turn her fingers white within minutes, and she had learned to work fast, scrubbing the heavy woolen canvas against the rocks, wringing them with hands that were growing stronger each day, even as the blisters refused to heal. She did not hear the bear until it was already at the opposite bank. Black bear. Not the largest she would ever see, but large enough. 300 pounds of muscle and teeth and hunger standing 40 feet away, dark eyes watching her with the flat curiosity of an animal deciding whether something was food. Clara froze. Every civilized instinct in her body, every carefully taught behavior, every lesson from drawing rooms and dinner tables, all of it became useless in a single heartbeat. Her legs would not move. Her lungs would not fill. The wet shirt in her hands dripped onto the rocks, and she could not let it go. The bear took a step into the water. The gunshot cracked across the creek valley like the sky splitting open. The bullet struck the water 3 feet in front of the bear, close enough to spray its face, and the animal lunged backward, scrambled up the bank and vanished into the undergrowth with a crashing of branches that faded into silence. Silas stood on the ridge above her. Rifle-shouldered smoke curling from the barrel, his face as blank as the mountain stone. He came down the slope in long strides, moving the way he always moved, economical. Deliberate, each step placed with the precision of a man who had crossed terrain under fire and never lost the habit of watching where his feet went. He looked at Clara. She was shaking. The wet shirt had fallen from her hands. Her face was white. "You stood still," he said. "Good. Most people run. That's the fastest way to die." Clara's voice shook. "I wasn't brave. I was too frightened to move." Something shifted in Silas's expression. Not softness exactly. Something quieter than that. Something like recognition. "Brave isn't the absence of fear," he said. "Brave is being terrified and not running. You passed." He turned and walked back up the ridge. Clara watched him go, this man who spoke in short sentences and carried a rifle like it was part of his body and had just saved her life with the casual efficiency of someone swatting a fly. And she felt something she had not felt in all her 24 years of careful, controlled, proper living. She felt alive. That night, Silas said 3 words to Boone and Wyatt that changed everything. "She stays." Boone looked at him. "You sure?" "Sure." Wyatt leaned back in his chair and grinned. "I owe somebody $5. Boone did not smile, but something in his posture loosened some tension he had been carrying since the girl arrived, and he reached for his journal. The leather-bound book he wrote in every night when he thought no one was watching, and for the first time in a long while he wrote something other than grief. The wedding was simple enough to barely exist. The minister rode up from Ashford on a Tuesday, a small man with spectacles and a Bible that had seen better days. He read the vows from memory because the light was too dim to read, and Clara and Silas repeated them standing in front of the cabin with the Blue Ridge Mountains stretching behind them in every direction like the world had no edges. There was no wedding dress. Clara wore the cleanest thing she owned, a cotton dress she had washed in the creek and pressed with a heated stone. There were no flowers from a shop. Wyatt had disappeared into the woods that morning and returned with a bundle of wild columbine and mountain laurel tied together with a piece of rope because ribbon was not something three men kept on hand. There was no reception, no guests, no music. Boone cooked a meal that was better than anything Clara had eaten since arriving. Venison with wild herbs, cornbread with honey-roasted apples from a tree that grew in the clearing behind the cabin. They ate at the rough plank table by candlelight, and nobody spoke much because these were people who had learned that silence was not the absence of something, but a thing unto itself full and warm. When the minister left riding his mule back down the mountain with 25 cents in his pocket and a story he would tell in Ashford for years, Clara and Silas were alone in the bedroom. The room was small, bed, a chair, a washstand, a window that looked east toward the sunrise. Clara stood near the door, and Silas stood near the window, and between them lay the weight of everything this moment was supposed to mean. Clara was a virgin. This was not a secret, not a surprise. It was simply a fact that carried a different gravity when the man she had married 10 minutes ago was standing 3 feet away and the door was closed, and every word her mother had ever spoken about wifely duty was running through her head like a prayer she no longer believed in. She was trembling, not from cold. Silas looked at her, looked at the way her hands gripped the fabric of her dress, looked at the pulse hammering in her throat. And then he did the thing that Clara Whitfield, with all her Boston education and her mother's careful instruction and her 24 years of learning what men expected, did not expect. He sat down on the floor, put his back against the wall, and spoke without looking at her. I don't take what isn't given freely. When you're ready, you tell me. Until then, you sleep in the bed. I sleep here. Clara stared at him. The words did not fit inside any framework she had been given for understanding men. Her mother had said the marriage bed was a wife's obligation, the price of shelter, the cost of being kept. And here was a man who could take whatever he wanted, a man who outweighed her by 100 pounds and owned the roof over her head and had every legal right that the year 1878 afforded a husband, and he was choosing the floor. She stood there for a long time trying to make sense of it. And then she understood something that rearranged everything she thought she knew about strength and gentleness and what it meant to be powerful. It was not that Silas was gentle. He was not gentle. He was a man who had killed in war, who split logs with a single stroke, who had shot at a bear without hesitation. There was nothing soft about him, but he had chosen deliberately to set his power down. Not because he lacked it, because he respected her enough to let her choose when and how to pick it up. Thank you, she whispered. Silas pulled his coat over his chest and closed his eyes. Good night, Mrs. Hadley. Clara lay in the bed and listened to his breathing through the darkness, and something that had been locked inside her since she was old enough to understand what the world expected of women began very slowly to crack. She did not know it yet, but the cracking was the beginning. The weeks that followed were the strangest of Clara's life. She woke each morning before dawn because that was when the cabin stirred, and she learned quickly that on a mountain daylight was currency not to be wasted. She cooked breakfast with hands that grew surer each day, learning the fire's moods, reading the coals the way Boone had shown her. She washed clothes, she hauled water, she mended things because mending was the one skill she had arrived with, and the men's clothing was in a state that would have made her mother weep. She mended everything, shirts with tears from branches, trousers worn thin at the knee, coats with seams splitting from years of hard use. She worked with the needle and thread she had brought from Boston, and when the thread ran out, she unraveled fabric scraps and spun her own, because wasting material on a mountain was a sin equal to wasting food. Boone watched her sew one evening, the firelight catching the quick flash of her needle, and said something quiet that Clara almost missed. Your stitches are better than my mother's. It was the longest sentence he had spoken to her directly, and it meant more to Clara than any compliment she had ever received in a Boston drawing room. But it was Silas who surprised her most. He kept his distance, not coldly, not with rejection, but with a deliberateness that Clara slowly recognized as care. He spoke to her at meals, asked about her day, answered her questions with the sparse efficiency she was learning to translate. He left the pistol beside her bed every night when he took watch. He checked her work without criticism, and when she did something well, he said so, briefly. Good. That's right. You're learning. And every night he slept on the floor. Clara asked Wyatt about Silas's past one afternoon while they were feeding the horses. She had learned that Wyatt was the easiest of the three to talk to, not because he was more open, but because he used humor as a bridge the way other men used handshakes. His leg, Clara said. He limps in the mornings. What happened? Wyatt's grin faded. He was quiet for a moment, stroking the horse's neck. Then Chickamauga, 63, artillery shell. He doesn't talk about it. 3 words. A place, a year, a weapon. But they opened a window into a man Clara was only beginning to understand. Silas had been 17 at Chickamauga. A boy. He had gone to war before he was old enough to understand what war meant, and he had come back with a leg that ached every morning and eyes that sometimes looked at things that were not there. Clara did not ask more, but she watched Silas differently after that. Watched the way he paused at the porch each evening, scanning the tree line with a focus that had nothing to do with bears or wolves. Watched the way he slept with one hand on his rifle. Watched the way loud sounds, a door slamming, an axe striking stone, made his shoulders tighten for just a fraction of a second before he forced them down. The wound on his leg was not the only wound he carried from the war. It was just the only one she could see. There was something else, something deeper, something the mountain kept quiet about and the men never mentioned. She could feel it the way you feel a change in weather before the clouds arrive. An absence, a shape in the negative space of their lives, a room in the cabin with a door that stayed closed, a name that was never spoken. Clara did not ask, not yet. She was learning that on this mountain trust was not given. It was earned in increments so small they were almost invisible, and pushing too fast was the surest way to lose it. But she noticed, and she remembered, and she filed it away in the same part of her mind that stored stitch patterns and thread counts and the precise tension needed to hold a seam together under pressure. Because Clara Whitfield may have arrived on this mountain knowing nothing about mountains, but she knew everything about how things were stitched together, and she was beginning to see the places where these 3 men were coming apart at the seams. On a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after the wedding, Clara woke to the sound of voices, not inside the cabin, outside. Low, urgent, the kind of voices men use when they don't want to be heard. She went to the window. In the pre-dawn gray, Silas Boone and Wyatt stood in the clearing. Silas held a piece of paper, a letter delivered by someone in the night. His face, always controlled, had gone rigid in a way Clara had not seen before. Boone's massive hands were clenched at his sides. Wyatt was checking his rifle with the automatic precision of a man preparing for something he hoped would not come. Clara could not hear the words, but she could read their bodies, the tension in Silas's shoulders, the way Boone shifted his weight like a man bracing for a blow, the way Wyatt's eyes kept moving to the trail that led down to Ashford. Something was wrong, something bigger than bears or wolves or burnt bread. Something that had arrived in the night on a piece of paper and changed the air around these 3 men, the way a storm changes the pressure before the first drop falls. Clara pressed her palm against the cold glass of the window. And somewhere deep inside, in the place where the cracking had begun on her wedding night, she felt the first tremor of what was coming. The letter's contents were still a mystery to her. The name Franklin Mercer meant nothing. Not yet. But 800 acres of old-growth oak had already been circled on a map in a New York office, and the mountain she was learning to love was being measured for destruction by men who had never set foot on it. But she knew this, the life she was building, this fragile, improbable, extraordinary life on a mountaintop with a man who slept on the floor out of respect, and his scarred brother who cradled herbs like children, and his quick-eyed friend who bet $5 she would fail. This life was about to be threatened. And the woman she was becoming, the one with calloused hands and a straight back and a pistol on her nightstand, would have to decide what she was willing to do to keep it. Meanwhile, in the town of Ashford, in the back room of the only hotel worth the name, a man named Thomas Greer sat at a writing desk with a glass of bourbon and a list. The list contained every family that owned land on Blue Ridge Mountain. Most of the names had been crossed out, purchased, persuaded, pressured. One way or another they had signed. One name remained. Hadley. 800 acres. Not for sale. Thomas took a sip of bourbon and smiled the way a man smiles when an obstacle is not a problem, but a puzzle, and puzzles were what he did best. He dipped his pen and began a letter to Franklin Mercer in New York. Last family, 2 brothers, 1 associate, Civil War veterans, stubborn, isolated. Will require creative approach. He paused, then added a line. Interesting development. Silas Hadley has recently married. Mail order bride from Boston. A woman of education in a place with none. She may prove to be the reasonable voice in an unreasonable household. He signed the letter, sealed it, and set it aside for the Morning Post. Then he opened a second piece of paper and began making notes. Names, connections, leverage points. The kind of information that turns people into chess pieces. Clara Whitfield Hadley's name went on that list. And neither she nor the three men sleeping on their mountain had any idea that the ground beneath them had already begun to shift. Silas taught her to shoot on a Wednesday, not because he wanted to, not because he thought she needed to become a marksman or carry a weapon the way he and Boone and Wyatt carried theirs, like extensions of their own bodies, like extra limbs grown from years of necessity. He taught her because on a mountain, a person who could not defend themselves was a person waiting to die, and Silas Hadley had buried enough people in his lifetime. They walked to a clearing a quarter-mile east of the cabin where the trees opened up and a fallen oak provided a natural bench. Silas set 6 tin cans on a rock ledge at 30 paces and handed Clara his spare rifle. A Winchester lever action, oiled and clean, heavier than the pistol he left by her bed each night. Clara took it with both hands. The stock was warm from where Silas had been carrying it against his body, and the wood was smooth, worn down by years of use until it felt almost alive under her fingers. She held it the way she had seen Silas hold his shoulder pressed to the butt, cheek against the stock left hand supporting the barrel. "You're gripping too tight," Silas said. He stood behind her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating off his chest but not touching. Never touching unless she initiated it. That was the rule he had established without ever speaking it aloud, and he had not broken it once. The rifle isn't going to run away. Hold it firm, not strangled, like holding reins on a horse that trusts you. Clara adjusted her grip, breathed in, squeezed the trigger. The recoil slammed into her shoulder like a fist. The rifle jumped. The cans remained untouched. Clara stumbled backward half a step, and her ears rang with a high, thin sound that erased every other noise on the mountain. Silas did not laugh, did not sigh, did not show the faintest flicker of disappointment. He simply said what he always said. Again. She fired again, missed again. The cans sat on their ledge looking smug. Clara's shoulder was already throbbing, a deep bruise forming under the skin, and her hands were shaking from the vibration and the adrenaline and the frustration of failing at something she had never done before in front of a man whose competence made her own inadequacy feel enormous. Again. On the 10th shot, she hit a can. The ping of lead striking tin echoed across the clearing, and the can spun off the ledge and disappeared into the grass. Clara lowered the rifle and stared at the empty spot where it had been. Something was happening inside her chest. Not pride exactly, something more fundamental than that. A rearrangement, like a key turning in a lock she didn't know existed. By the 20th shot, she was grouping within inches of center. By the 50th, the rifle had stopped being a foreign object and started becoming a part of her body, an extension of her arms and eyes and breath that connected her to a kind of power she had never been permitted to access. She set the rifle down, looked at Silas, and said the thing that surprised them both. "I'm not the porcelain doll you thought I was. Nobody ever gave me the chance to prove it." Silas looked at her for a long time. The mountain was quiet around them, just wind in the pines and a hawk circling somewhere overhead. Then he nodded, a single deliberate movement of his head, and Clara understood in the language she was learning to speak that the nod meant more than any compliment. It meant respect, from a man who did not give it easily. They walked back to the cabin in silence, but the silence was different from the silences of her first weeks on the mountain. Those had been the silences of strangers sharing space. This was the silence of two people who had just understood something about each other that words would only diminish. That night, Clara lay in bed with the pistol on her nightstand and the bruise on her shoulder pulsing with each heartbeat, and she thought about power, about how she had lived 24 years in Boston, surrounded by men who held doors open and pulled out chairs and tipped their hats and called her Miss with practiced courtesy, and not a single one of them had ever put a weapon in her hands and said, "Protect yourself." They had wrapped her in politeness like cotton around China, and she had mistaken the wrapping for care. Silas Hadley did not wrap things. He built them to withstand impact. She was beginning to understand the difference. Wyatt taught her to ride the way the mountain demanded. Not the gentle trot of Boston carriages and Sunday park rides, but real riding, the kind where the horse moved beneath you like water over rock and the trail dropped away at angles that made your stomach climb into your throat. The first time the horse broke into a gallop down a steep grade, Clara screamed. The sound tore out of her before she could stop it, raw and high, and nothing like anything that had ever come out of her mouth in a Boston parlor. But it was not a scream of fear. It was a scream of something else entirely. Something that had been locked inside her for 24 years and had finally found the key. Wyatt pulled his horse alongside hers, grinning wide enough to show the gap where a molar had been knocked out in a bar fight in Tennessee 12 years ago. "You're starting to look like a mountain woman," he shouted over the wind, and Clara laughed. Not the practiced, polite laugh of dinner parties. A laugh that came from somewhere primal, somewhere that did not care about posture or propriety or what anyone thought. Boone taught her leather. This was where Clara's Boston life and her mountain life finally intersected. She knew how to sew. Her mother had made certain of that the same way she had made certain Clara could set a table and arrange flowers and write thank you notes on proper stationery. Clara could stitch silk so finely the thread disappeared. She could mend cotton so cleanly the repair was invisible. But leather was a different animal. Boone showed her how to tan a deer hide, scraping the flesh, side clean, working the brain mixture into the skin with her bare hands until it softened, stretching it on a frame to dry on. The process was physical in a way that silk never was. It demanded strength, patience, endurance. The hide fought back. It resisted the needle. It required force. Clara loved it. She loved the resistance. Loved the way the leather demanded. She pushed harder, grip tighter, commit more of herself to each stitch. Loved the way the finished product was not delicate or pretty, but strong, functional, made to last. She began making things. Gloves for Wyatt, whose old ones had worn through at the fingers, a sheath for Boone's hunting knife tooled with a simple pattern she designed herself. A belt for Silas stitched with a precision that made Boone raise his eyebrows and say for the second time since she had arrived, something that was almost a compliment. "Your hands know things your head hasn't caught up with yet." Clara looked at her hands. They were not the hands she had brought to this mountain. The blisters had healed into calluses. There were small cuts from the leather knife, a burn scar from a cooking accident, in the first week a roughness in the skin that no amount of cream would ever smooth away. Her mother would have been horrified. Clara thought they were the most beautiful hands she had ever owned. The skill she was building with leather and needle and thread would soon matter in ways far beyond gloves and sheaths and belts. That reckoning was coming, carried up the mountain on a piece of paper in the pocket of a man who smiled too easily. One evening by the fire, with autumn settling into the mountains and the nights growing cold enough to see breath, Clara asked Silas about the war. She had learned by now that questions on this mountain were like seeds. You planted them and waited. Sometimes they grew. Sometimes they died in the soil. You could not force them. Silas was quiet for a long time. The fire popped and sent sparks spiraling upward like tiny, desperate stars. Boone was outside on watch. Wyatt was oiling his rifle in the corner, pretending not to listen. Then Silas spoke, not looking at Clara. Looking at the fire, at the flames eating the wood, at something beyond the flames that only he could see. First night under artillery, Chickamauga, September of '63. I was 17 years old. Boone was 20. We were in a trench that wasn't deep enough to protect a Duig, and the shells were coming in so fast the ground never stopped shaking. He paused. His hands were still in his lap, but Clara could see the tendons standing out, the knuckles white. I wet myself. First barrage. Just let go. Couldn't control it. 17 years old, and I was lying in mud and my own urine while the world exploded above me. The fire cracked. Wyatt had stopped oiling his rifle. Boone was next to me. He looked over and said, "It's all right. Everybody does it the first time." But I looked at his trousers. They were dry. He lied so I wouldn't feel ashamed. And Silas's voice was steady, the way a man's voice is steady when he has told himself a story so many times it has worn smooth like riverstone. But his eyes were not steady. They were looking at something Clara could not follow. "Why did you come back to the mountain?" she asked quietly. "Because up here I don't have to pretend. Don't have to smile when I'm not smiling. Don't have to explain why sometimes I can't sleep, or why loud noises make me reach for a weapon that isn't there, or why some mornings I wake up and it takes me a minute to remember which year it is. Clara wanted to reach across the space between them and take his hand, but she had learned that reaching for Silas before he was ready was like reaching for a wounded animal. The instinct to pull away was stronger than the desire to be touched, so she did not reach. She sat still, she listened, and she let the silence do the work that words could not. After a long while, Silas looked at her, really looked. Not the assessing gaze of their first meeting when he had measured her against the mountain and found her wanting. This was different. This was one person recognizing another. "You asked about my leg once," he said. "Wyatt told you. Chickamauga, artillery." Clara nodded. "The leg is the small wound, the one people can see." He paused. "There are bigger ones, ones that don't show." He did not say more, but Clara heard what lived inside the silence. The sound of a door in the cabin that stayed closed. The shape of an absence she had felt since her first week. The name that was never spoken. She filed it away, not pushing, not prying, just holding the knowledge carefully the way she held fragile thread with steady hands and patience and the understanding that some things revealed themselves only when they were ready. But there was something else Silas had not told her. Something about a boy named Samuel and a woman whose grave was somewhere on this mountain, and 20 years of sleeping alone, not because he preferred solitude, but because he was terrified of what it meant to let someone close enough to lose. That truth would surface, but not yet. What came first was Thomas Greer. Clara was alone at the cabin. Silas and Boone had gone to check the trap lines in the high country, a 2-day trip that took them above the tree line where the air was thin and the elk still moved in autumn herds. Wyatt was in Ashford selling hides and buying winter supplies. Clara had the cabin to herself for the first time since her arrival, and she was using the solitude to work on a leather vest she had been designing in her head for weeks. The sound of hooves on the trail reached her before the riders appeared. 5 men, 4 of them were large, rough-looking, the kind of men who swung axes for a living and settled disagreements with their fists. They rode workhorses and wore canvas coats and did not bother to dismount. The 5th man was different. Thomas Greer rode a bay gelding with polished tack and dismounted with the easy grace of someone accustomed to being watched. He was 35, clean-shaven hair, pomaded, wearing a vest and tie under a tailored coat that had no business being on a mountain trail. His boots were polished. His smile was immediate, warm, and completely empty of anything real. "Mrs. Hadley," he said, removing his hat with a practiced motion. "My name is Thomas Greer. I represent the Mercer Timber Company. I was hoping to speak with your husband about a business proposition." Clara stood on the porch. She was wearing a leather apron over her dress, and her hands were stained dark from the tanning solution she had been working with. The needle she had been using was still in her right hand. Behind her, through the open cabin door, Silas's spare rifle leaned against the wall. "My husband isn't here," she said. Thomas looked past her at the cabin. His eyes moved with a professional thoroughness, cataloging the property, estimating the timber value of the surrounding forest, noting the absence of the men whose presence would have complicated his visit. "That's unfortunate. Perhaps I could leave some documents for him. The Mercer Timber Company that has acquired logging rights to most of the Blue Ridge Corridor. We're prepared to make a very generous offer for the Hadley property. I'll tell him you came by." That was what Clara Whitfield would have said. Polite, non-committal, avoiding conflict the way she had been taught to avoid puddles in her good shoes. But Clara Whitfield was not the one standing on this porch. Clara Hadley set down the needle, walked inside, came back with the Winchester. Did not point it at anyone, just held it. Naturally, the way Silas held his, the way a person holds something that belongs in their hands. "You're standing on Hadley land," she said. Her voice was calm in a way that surprised even her. Not calm like stillness, calm like deep water, the kind that has a current underneath strong enough to drag a man down. "I suggest you leave before my husband gets back. He's less polite than I am." Thomas Greer's smile did not falter, but something behind it shifted. Some calculation adjusted. He looked at Clara with new eyes, the way a chess player looks at a piece that has moved in an unexpected direction. "Of course," he said. "My apologies for the intrusion." He put his hat back on and mounted his horse. But before he turned it toward the trail, he spoke again, and this time the warmth was gone from his voice. "You're from Boston, aren't you, Mrs. Hadley? An educated woman. I imagine you must find this life quite different from what you're accustomed to." Clara said nothing. She held the rifle and watched him with eyes that had learned in 4 months on a mountain to stop looking away from things that frightened her. Thomas touched the brim of his hat. "Good day, ma'am. I'm sure we'll speak again." They rode away. Clara stood on the porch until the sound of hooves faded entirely, until the forest had swallowed them, and the silence returned, filling the space they had left, like water filling a hole in sand. Then she set the rifle down and realized her hands were shaking. Not from fear, from something else. From the strange electric awareness that she had just done something the woman she used to be could never have done. She had stood her ground, alone, against 5 men, and she had not blinked. When Silas returned the next evening, Clara told him everything. She described Thomas Greer's tailored coat and polished boots and empty smile. She described the 4 men who had not dismounted. She described the offer and the threat that lived under its surface like rocks under shallow water. Silas listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at her with an expression she had not seen before. Not concern, not anger, something warmer than both. "You handled it right," he said. And then after a silence that lasted long enough for the fire to pop twice, "I'm proud of you." 4 words, simple, direct, carrying more weight than any speech. Clara felt them land in her chest like stones in still water, sending ripples outward to places she did not know she had. Down in Ashford, in the back room of the hotel, Thomas Greer wrote a different kind of letter. Not to Mercer, not yet. This one was addressed to a private investigator in Boston. It requested information about Clara Whitfield, family, background, circumstances of departure. Thomas Greer had built a career on finding pressure points, on understanding that every person had a door and every door had a key. He had seen something in Clara's eyes on that porch beneath the calm and the rifle and the steady voice. He had seen what she was protecting. Not just the land, not just the men, something older, something she had brought with her from Boston and buried so deep she probably thought no one would ever find it. Thomas intended to dig it up. And 1,000 miles away in a brownstone on Beacon Hill, a man named Edwin Price sat in a leather chair reading a letter from a woman named Margaret Whitfield. The letter said that her daughter had disappeared, that she feared Clara had done something foolish, that she begged Mr. Price's patience and understanding. Edwin Price folded the letter with precise, unhurried hands. He was 55 years old. His first wife had died. People said illness. People said a lot of things that were easier than the truth. He had thin lips and thin patience, and the particular cruelty of a man who believed that anything he paid for belonged to him, including people. He set the letter on his desk and began composing a reply. Clara Whitfield would be found. Clara Whitfield would be returned. He had paid for a bride and he intended to collect. But Clara Whitfield no longer existed. And the woman who had taken her place was holding a rifle on a mountain in North Carolina and learning one calloused hand at a time how to become someone that Edwin Price would not recognize. The nights grew longer and the air on the mountain turned sharp with the promise of early frost. Clara and Silas had been married for 6 weeks, and in that time the space between them had changed. The way a river changes course slowly, imperceptibly, until one day you look up and realize the water is flowing in a direction it never flowed before. Silas still slept on the floor. Clara had stopped asking him to move. She understood that this was not about reluctance or indifference. It was about a man who had spent 20 years building walls around himself and did not know how to take them down even when he wanted to. Because he did want to. Clara could see it, in the way his hand lingered when he passed her the salt at dinner, in the way his eyes followed her across the cabin when he thought she wasn't looking, in the way he stood closer to her each day, the distance between them shrinking in increments, so small they were measured not in inches but in the quality of the air. The storm came on a Thursday night, not the gentle rains of autumn, but a mountain storm, the kind that turned the sky black at 4 in the afternoon and shook the cabin walls and sent water pouring through every gap in the cedar shakes. Lightning split the darkness and thunder rolled across the ridges like cannon fire. And for Silas, who had spent 4 years under artillery bombardment, thunder was never just thunder. Clara found him on the porch, Soaking wet rifle in his hands, eyes scanning the tree line with a focus that had nothing to do with the storm. She had learned to recognize the look. He was not in 1878. He was in 1863. Back in the trench at Chickamauga, 17 years old, with shells exploding overhead, and the world reduced to mud and noise, and the absolute certainty that the next second might be the last. She did not call his name, did not touch him. She simply sat down beside him on the porch in the rain and waited. It took 10 minutes. 10 minutes of rain soaking through her dress and lightning turning the forest white and thunder shaking the boards beneath them. Then Silas's breathing changed, slowed. His grip on the rifle loosened. His eyes found the present. He looked at Clara. Wet hair plastered to her face, dress soaked through, sitting in a storm on a mountain porch, because she had understood without being told that what he needed was not comfort, but company. "You should be inside," he said. His voice was rough, sandpaper on stone. "So should you." They sat in the rain for another minute. Then Silas stood, and Clara stood, and they went inside together. The cabin was warm from the fire Boone had built before turning in. Silas stood by the hearth water pooling at his feet, and Clara stood beside him, and the distance between them that had been shrinking for weeks suddenly collapsed. Clara reached for his hand. Not an accident, not a brush of fingers while passing a plate, a deliberate, conscious choice. Her hand closed around his, and she felt the calluses and the scars and the rough skin of a man who had built everything he owned with these hands and had destroyed things with them too, and had spent 20 years keeping them to himself. Silas looked down at their joined hands, at the way her grip matched his. Firm, certain, earned, not Boston anymore. Mountain. "You've changed," he said quietly. "I know," Clara said. "And I don't want you sleeping on the floor anymore." This was not obligation, not duty, not the wifely surrender her mother had described in whispered shameful lessons before her wedding that never happened. This was choice, pure and conscious and fierce in its certainty. Clara was choosing this man the way she had chosen this mountain, not because it was safe, because it was real. Silas Hadley had not been held by another person in 20 years. The last woman who had touched him was buried on the hillside behind the cabin, and the boy they had made together was buried beside her. He had sealed that part of himself shut the way you seal a wound with pressure and time and the refusal to look at it. Clara's hand on his opened it. They stood by the fire for a long time, not speaking, just holding on. And somewhere in the warmth between their palms, the two separate stories they had been living, his about survival and hers about escape, began to merge into something neither of them had a name for yet. Wyatt rode into the cabin, clearing 2 days later, with his face drawn tight and a letter in his hand. He had been in Ashford selling hides when the postmaster flagged him down. Official correspondence from the Ashford Town Council, addressed to the Hadley household. Silas read it on the porch. Boone stood beside him, arms crossed, reading over his shoulder. Clara watched from the doorway, reading their bodies the way she had learned to read weather, looking for the signs of what was coming. Mercer Timber Company has filed for eminent domain rights over all unclaimed and disputed forest land on the Blue Ridge Corridor, Silas read aloud. His voice was flat, controlled the way it got when something hit hard enough to require containment. All property owners are required to present valid deeds or vacate within 30 days. 30 days. The words hung in the mountain air like smoke. "The land isn't unclaimed," Boone said. His voice was a low rumble, tectonic. "Father bought it. Grandfather cleared it. We have rights." "Rights require proof," Silas said. "Paper proof. Do we have paper?" Silence. The kind of silence that answers a question more honestly than words. They did not have paper. Not here, not in the cabin. The deed, if it still existed, was somewhere else. Somewhere Silas had not been in years. "Father's strongbox," Boone said. "Under the old cabin, the original one. The one Grandfather built." "That cabin fell down 8 years ago," Wyatt said. "It's 2 days' ride into the high timber. And there's no guarantee the box survived." "There's no guarantee of anything," Silas said. He looked at the letter again. 30 days. "But without that deed, Mercer takes the land, legally. And we have nothing to fight with except rifles, and rifles don't win against judges." Clara stepped forward. Every eye turned to her. "Then we get the deed," she said. It was not a question. not a suggestion. It was a statement of fact delivered with the calm certainty of a woman who had learned to shoot a rifle, ride a horse down a mountain, and face down 5 men on her own porch in the span of 4 months. A woman who had stopped asking permission. Down in Ashford, the news spread the way news always spreads in small towns, through whispers and assumptions, and the practiced art of saying one thing while meaning another. The Mercer Timber Company was buying everything. Roads were coming, a mill was coming, jobs were coming. Progress, that great American engine, was chugging up the Blue Ridge like a locomotive with no brakes, and anyone standing on the tracks had better move. Franklin Mercer arrived in Ashford on a Tuesday. He came by private coach from the rail terminus in Marion, accompanied by Thomas Greer, and a lawyer from New York whose suit cost more than most Ashford families earned in a year. Mercer was 55, silver-haired, impeccably groomed. His hands were clean, the way only the hands of men who paid others to work for them were clean. He smiled frequently, shook hands firmly, and spoke with the quiet authority of a man who had never in his life been told no and expected to accept it. He took a suite at the Ashford Hotel. He had dinner with the mayor. He made a donation to the town church. And by the end of his first week, every shopkeeper, farmer, and laborer in Ashford believed that Franklin Mercer was the best thing that had ever happened to their town. Thomas Greer handled the details, the land acquisitions, the persuasions, the occasional applications of pressure. And when the private investigator's report arrived from Boston, Thomas read it in his room with a glass of bourbon and a smile that had nothing warm about it. Clara Whitfield, daughter of Harold Whitfield, deceased book printer, mother Margaret Whitfield, fled Boston 6 months ago to avoid an arranged marriage to Edwin Price, widower merchant. Price has made inquiries about her whereabouts. Mother has cooperated. Price wants her returned. Thomas set the report down and tapped his finger against the desk. There it was, the pressure point, the key to the door. He wrote to Mercer, a brief note hand-delivered to the suite down the hall. I have leverage on the Hadley wife. Permission to proceed. Mercer's reply came within the hour, a single word written in his precise, elegant hand. Proceed. Back on the mountain, Clara and Silas had a fight, not with fists or weapons, with words which between two stubborn people could be just as damaging. Clara wanted to go find the deed. She would ride with Wyatt to the old cabin site 2 days each way and bring back the strongbox. Silas wanted to go himself. Boone's ribs were still tender from where he had strained them hauling timber the week before, and Silas did not want Clara on a 4-day ride through high country where the trails were steep and the weather was turning and 100 things could go wrong. It's dangerous, Silas said. They were standing in the cabin facing each other across the table, and the air between them was the kind of air that precedes lightning. Everything here is dangerous, Clara replied. That hasn't stopped me yet. This is different. The high timber in autumn, the trails wash out, trees come down. The temperature drops 30 degrees in an hour. You've been riding for 3 months. That doesn't make you ready for this. Clara planted her hands on the table and leaned forward. You need to stay with Boone. He can barely lift his arms. If Mercer's men come while you're gone, who defends this cabin, Boone alone with strained ribs? Wyatt can stay. Wyatt knows the high country, I don't. You've been there 100 times. Wyatt's been there 100 times. One of you goes with me, one stays with Boone. That's the smart play, and you know it. Silas stared at her, jaw tight, eyes hard. The look of a man who was being beaten in an argument by logic he could not refute. Boone, sitting by the fire, pretending to read, coughed what might have been a laugh. She's right, Boone said without looking up. Silas turned the stare on his brother. Boone absorbed it without flinching, the way a mountain absorbs weather. She's right and you know it, Boone repeated. She's not the woman who got off that mule in the spring. Let her go. A long silence. Silas looked at Clara, looked at the hands that held leather needles and rifle stocks with equal certainty, looked at the woman who had stood on his porch with a Winchester and sent 5 men running, looked at his wife, who had become someone neither of them had expected. All right, he said. The word came out like it cost him something. You go, with Wyatt, you find the deed, and you come back. Clara heard what he did not say. Come back to me. I'll come back, she said. The night before Clara left, Silas did something he had not done since before the war. He made something with his hands that was not functional. Not a fence post or a door frame or a shelf. He carved a wooden comb from a piece of mountain laurel, smooth as silk with teeth fine enough to work through Clara's hair without pulling. It took him all evening sitting by the fire with his knife and the wood shaping it with the same precision he applied to everything, because Silas Hadley did not know how to do anything halfway. He left it on her pillow without a word. Clara found it when she went to bed. She held it in her hands and traced the teeth with her fingertip, and understood that for a man who spoke in sentences of 3 words or less, this was a love letter. She left before dawn. Wyatt was already saddled and waiting, his rifle slung and a bedroll tied behind his horse. Clara wore leather riding pants. She had made herself a coat lined with rabbit fur and boots that Boone had helped her waterproof with beeswax. She carried the pistol Silas had given her, a canteen, dried meat, and the quiet, focused determination of a woman who had something to lose. Silas stood on the porch and watched her ride away. He did not wave. He did not call out. He watched until she and Wyatt disappeared around the first bend of the trail, and then he stood there for another 10 minutes watching the empty trail as if his attention alone could keep her safe. Boone came out and stood beside him. "She'll be fine," Boone said. "I know." "Well, and then why are you still standing here?" Silas did not answer. He went back inside and began loading rifles. The ride to the old cabin took 2 hard days through terrain that tested every skill Clara had learned. The trails narrowed to single track, winding along ridge lines where a wrong step meant a 100-foot drop into granite ravines. The air thinned as they climbed, and the temperature fell with every 1,000 feet of elevation. By the first night, frost had silvered the ground, and Clara's breath came in white clouds that vanished before they reached the stars. They camped in a hollow sheltered by rock. Wyatt built a fire small enough to hide and large enough to survive, and they sat across from each other eating dried venison and watching the darkness beyond the firelight move with the small sounds of a living forest. "Can I ask you something?" Clara said. "You just did." Clara smiled. "Something real." Wyatt poked the fire. Sparks rose. "Go ahead." "Why do you stay with Silas and Boone? You're not blood. You could go anywhere, do anything. Why stay on a mountain with 2 men who barely talk?" Wyatt was quiet for a while. When he spoke, the humor was gone from his voice, replaced by something raw and careful, like a wound being cleaned. "I was 8 when my parents died. Typhoid. Both of them in the same week. After that, it was orphanages, and then streets, and then lying about my age to join the army, because at least in the army they fed you." He broke a stick and tossed the halves into the fire. "I was 15. First battle, I froze. Couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't do anything except stand there while men died around me. Silas dragged me behind a wall. He was 17, already wounded, already bleeding. But he dragged me behind that wall and held me there until I could breathe again." Wyatt looked at Clara across the fire. "Nobody had ever come back for me before. Not once in my entire life. He came back for me when he was bleeding. You don't leave that, ever." Clara felt something tighten in her throat. "And Boone? Boone sat with me that night. I was shaking so hard my teeth were rattling. Boone put his coat over me and said, 'You're ours now. That means we don't leave you behind.' And they never did. 15 years old, no family, no home, no nothing. And these 2 men just decided I was theirs." He cleared his throat. The humor crept back into his voice like a friend returning from a long trip. "So yeah, I stay. And now you're here, and that means you're ours too, family. Which means I'll ride through 2 days of mountain trail to find a piece of paper to keep you safe. And I'll do it smiling, because that's what Hadleys do." Clara said, "I'm not a Hadley by blood either." Wyatt grinned. "Neither am I. That's not how family works." On the morning of the second day, they found the old cabin, or what remained of it. The roof had collapsed years ago, and the walls had rotted into shapes that no longer remembered being straight. Vines had claimed the stones of the chimney, and the forest was already reclaiming the clearing saplings, pushing up through the floor, where Silas's grandfather had once sat by his own fire and looked out at his own piece of mountain. But the foundation stones were intact, and beneath the floor, where the earth had been dug out and lined with flat rock, they found it. An iron strongbox, rusted but whole, padlocked with a lock that Wyatt broke with a single swing of his hatchet. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had kept the moisture out for decades, were the documents. Land deed dated 1842. signed by a territorial judge, stamped with the seal of the state of North Carolina. 800 acres legally purchased, legally recorded, belonging to the Hadley family in perpetuity. Clara held the paper in hands that were shaking, not from cold, from the weight of what she held. This single sheet, yellowed and fragile, was the difference between keeping everything and losing everything, between home and exile, between the life she had built and the void she had escaped. "This is it," she said. "This is all we need." Wyatt was already packing the strongbox. "Then let's move. I want to be off this ridge before the weather turns." But the weather was not the threat. As they saddled the horses, Wyatt went still. The way a man goes still when his body knows something his mind has not yet processed. He crouched, touched the ground, and looked at his fingers. "Tracks," he said. "Fresh, multiple horses, heading southeast." Southeast, toward the cabin. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. "How many?" Wyatt studied the trail. His jaw tightened. 8, maybe 10, moving fast. They passed here this morning. Silas was at the cabin, with Boone. 2 men, one of them injured, against 8 or 10 riders who were heading their way with a purpose that did not need to be explained. Clara was on her horse before Wyatt finished speaking. The deed was in her coat, pressed against her chest. Her pistol was on her hip, and the woman who had once needed a borrowed mule to climb this mountain was now ready to ride down it at a speed that would have killed her 4 months ago. "Ride," she said. Wyatt mounted, checked his rifle, looked at her with an expression that was not quite a smile, but had respect written into every line of it. "Yes, ma'am," he said. And as they descended through darkness, the mountain behind them was already burning. Thomas Greer had not waited for morning. He had stopped at the tree line after leaving the cabin that afternoon and given an order to 3 of his men. Simple, direct, the kind of order that required no paperwork and left no witnesses. "The barn," he said. "Tonight. Make sure they see the flames." The men nodded and melted into the forest like smoke. 3 hours later, when the mountain was dark and the cabin was quiet, the fire came. Not from lightning, not from accident. From hands that struck matches and vanished before the first timber caught. Boone heard it first. The crackle, then the roar, then the horses screaming. He shouted. Silas was already moving, rifle in hand. And that was when the largest of Greer's men stepped from the shadows and swung a timber brace into Boone's ribs with the force of a man who had been paid to break things. Silas put a bullet past the man's ear, close enough to draw blood. The attacker staggered. The others scattered into the trees. But the barn was already beyond saving. Clara and Wyatt reached the clearing 20 minutes later, their horses lathered and heaving. They saw the flames before they saw the cabin. Orange light bleeding through the trees like a wound in the darkness. This was the moment from the beginning of our story. The fire that Clara ran into. The fire that burned away the last of what she had been and left only what she was becoming. She pulled the leather trunk from the burning barn while Wyatt cut the horses free, and Silas pressed a cloth to the cut on his arm from where a piece of burning timber had caught him. And Boone was on the ground, breathing in the short, broken gasps that meant something inside him had cracked. When the flames died down and the night went quiet again, they gathered on the porch. The deed was safe in Clara's coat. The hides were saved. The horses were shaken but alive. But the barn was gone, Boone's ribs were broken, and the message was clear. Thomas Greer was done with patience. "He'll be back tomorrow," Silas said, looking at the smoldering ruins, "with Mercer himself probably. And next time they won't just burn the barn." Clara looked at the deed pressed against her chest. Then she looked at the trail leading down to Ashford, and she made a decision that would change everything. Clara did not ride to Ashford because it was the plan. There had been no plan. There had been fire and broken ribs and the smell of smoke still clinging to her hair. But standing in the clearing with the barn reduced to embers and Boone breathing in shallow gasps and Silas loading rifles with the mechanical focus of a man preparing for siege, Clara saw what needed to happen next with the clarity that only exhaustion and desperation can produce. "I'm going to Ashford," she said. Silas looked up from his rifle. "Now, you hold the cabin, protect Boone. I take the deed to Judge Barrow before Greer comes back with Mercer." Silas stared at her. She stared back. The fire behind them was dying, but something in her eyes was not. "Wyatt goes with you," Silas said. Not a question. "Wyatt goes with me." He nodded once. That was all. Clara saddled a fresh horse while Wyatt checked his rifle. Ashford is 3 hours down, Wyatt said. Night trail, steep. You've never ridden it in the dark. Then I'd better start now. Wyatt looked at Clara, who sat on her horse with a deed against her chest and a certainty in her posture that reminded him with a sharp pang of Silas in the moments before a fight. The same stillness, the same absolute clarity about what needed to be done. After you, Mrs. Hadley. They rode down the mountain in darkness. The trail was everything Wyatt had warned about, and worse. Narrow enough in places that Clara's leg brushed the rock face on one side while the other side dropped away into nothing, just black air and the distant sound of water moving over stone 100 feet below. The horses picked their way with the careful, deliberate steps of animals who understood that one wrong placement meant death for them and their riders. Clara did not think about the drop. She thought about Silas standing on the porch with his rifle facing 10 men who wanted to take everything he had built. She thought about Boone ribs cracked reaching for a shotgun anyway, because that was what Hadleys did. She thought about the deed pressed against her heart, the paper that was worth more than gold, because gold could not buy what it represented. Land, legacy, home. And she thought about something Silas had said to her weeks ago sitting by the fire talking about the war. The guys who freeze up, the ones who keep trying to force the situation to match the plan, they're the ones who don't make it home. Adapt, improvise, move with the chaos instead of against it. The plan had been to bring the deed home and fight from the cabin. But plans change, situations change. And the woman who had arrived on this mountain unable to ride a mule had learned something about herself in 4 months that she might have gone a lifetime without discovering. She was not made for following plans. She was made for the moment when plans fell apart and someone had to decide in the space between one heartbeat and the next what to do instead. They reached the valley floor at 3 a.m. Ashford was dark, the buildings hunched along the main street like sleeping animals. No lamps burned except at the hotel where a single light showed in a second-floor window. Mercer's room, probably. Or Thomas Greer's. Men who stayed up late because the things they planned were better done in darkness. Clara rode past the hotel without slowing, past the general store and the blacksmith and the church with its white steeple pointed at stars that did not care about property deeds or timber companies or the small desperate struggles of people on a mountain in North Carolina. She stopped at a house at the edge of town, small, well-kept with a garden that even in autumn showed the attention of careful hands. A lamp was not burning. The windows were dark. The occupant was asleep because at 72 years old, Judge William Barrow had earned the right to sleep when he chose. Clara dismounted, her legs nearly buckled. She had been riding for 7 hours straight through terrain that would have been dangerous in daylight and was suicidal in the dark. Every muscle in her body was screaming. Her hands were raw from gripping the reins, and the cold had settled into her bones with the deep permanence of something that would take days to thaw. She knocked on the door. No answer. She knocked again harder. A lamp flickered to life inside. Footsteps shuffled across a wooden floor. The door opened the width of a chain, and a face appeared in the gap, lean, weathered with white hair and eyes that were still sharp enough to cut despite the decades of use. Who the devil is knocking at 3 a.m? Judge Barrow, my name is Clara Hadley. I'm Silas Hadley's wife, and I need your help. The old man studied her through the gap, took in the mud-stained clothes, the exhaustion carved into her face, the horse steaming behind her, the tall, lean man with the rifle standing in the shadows. His eyes moved down to the front of her coat where her hand pressed against her chest, holding something flat and rectangular against her body. You rode down the mountain in the dark. Yes, sir. The night trail. Yes, sir. Judge Barrow unchained the door, opened it wide. The lamplight fell across Clara like warm water, and for a moment she swayed on her feet, the adrenaline that had carried her down the mountain beginning to ebb. Come in, Barrow said, and bring that paper you're holding before you collapse on my porch. The judge's parlor smelled of pipe tobacco and old books, leather chairs, a desk cluttered with correspondence shelves lined with volumes of law that had probably been read and reread until their spines cracked. Barrow moved with the careful economy of a man who had learned not to waste motion. Clearing a chair for Clara, pouring whiskey from a bottle he kept in a desk drawer, setting it in front of her without asking if she wanted it. Clara drank. The whiskey burned a path from her throat to her stomach and lit a small fire there that pushed back against the cold. Then she took the deed from inside her coat and laid it on the judge's desk. Barrow sat down, put on spectacles, picked up the paper with hands that had a slight tremor from age, but moved with the precision of a man who had handled 10,000 documents and knew exactly what he was looking at. He read, slowly, carefully, the way a man reads when the words on a page might determine whether a family keeps their home. 1842, he said, territorial deed, signed by Judge Marcus Whitley of the Western District, State Seal of North Carolina. He set it down and looked at Clara over his spectacles. This is legitimate. I know. Mercer's logging rights were acquired from the state under the Reconstruction Land Redistribution Act of 1870. But that act explicitly excludes privately held land deeded before 1860. The judge tapped the paper with one finger. This predates the cutoff by 18 years. Mercer has no claim. None. Clara let out a breath she had been holding for 2 days. Then we keep our land. You keep your land. Barrow removed his spectacles and rubbed the bridge of his nose. But a piece of paper only works if someone with authority certifies it. And at this moment, the only authority in Ashford that Mercer hasn't purchased is sitting in this chair in his night clothes at 3:15 in the morning. Will you help us? Barrow looked at her for a long time. He was a man who had fought in the Civil War on the Union side, who had served as a judge for 20 years, who had retired to this quiet town because he was tired of watching power corrupt the men who wielded it. He had watched Franklin Mercer arrive in Ashford like a disease-buying people and positions with the casual indifference of a man who believed everything had a price. I'll ride up with you, he said, at first light, with an official certification and a letter to the state registrar that should make Mercer's lawyers choke on their breakfast. Clara stood. Her legs were steadier now, the whiskey and the hope doing their work. Thank you, Judge. Barrow waved his hand. Don't thank me yet. Mercer isn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. He'll look for another angle. Men like him always do. He can look all he wants, Clara said. He won't find one. The judge studied her face, this young woman who had ridden down a mountain in the dark alone, except for a rifleman and a piece of paper that was older than her parents, who stood in his parlor at 3 in the morning with mud in her hair and steel in her voice, and the absolute unshakable conviction of someone who had found the thing worth fighting for and would not be moved from it. Your husband is Silas Hadley, Barrow said. I knew his father, knew his grandfather, stubborn men, built from stone. Yes, sir. You match them. Clara allowed herself a small smile. I'm learning to. They left Ashford at dawn, Clara Wyatt and Judge Barrow on horseback riding up the mountain as the sun crested the eastern ridges and turned the Blue Ridge gold. The judge rode well for 72 straight, backed his coat, buttoned against the morning cold, a leather case strapped behind his saddle containing the certified deed and the letters that would end Franklin Mercer's claim on the Hadley land. They were halfway up the mountain when they met the riders coming down. 10 horses, Thomas Greer at the front, and behind him, on a black horse that must have cost more than every building in Ashford combined, Franklin Mercer himself. Mercer had not intended to come to the mountain. He was a man of offices and boardrooms, of telegrams and contracts of power exercised at a distance through intermediaries who kept his hands clean. But Thomas had sent word that the situation was deteriorating, that the Hadley men would not sign, that the wife had disappeared into the mountains with a purpose Thomas could not identify, and that the deadline was today. So Mercer came, because some things required a personal touch, and Franklin Mercer had not built an empire by delegating the moments that mattered. The two groups met on the trail where it widened enough for horses to pass. Clara pulled her horse to a stop. Wyatt moved his hand to his rifle. Judge Barrow sat his horse with the calm indifference of a man who had been shot at during the war and found most things since then relatively unimpressive. Thomas saw Clara, and something moved across his face. Surprise, and beneath it the rapid recalculation of a man whose chess piece had moved somewhere he did not expect. Mercer saw Judge Barrow, and his expression did not change. That was the thing about Mercer. His face was a mask he had perfected over decades, and nothing short of catastrophe could crack it. Mrs. Hadley, when Thomas said, "You've been traveling." Clara did not look at Thomas. She looked at Mercer, at the silver hair and the clean hands and the tailored coat and the polished boots that had never touched a trail before today. At the man who wanted to take her mountain. "Mr. Mercer," she said, I believe you're looking for something. Let me save you the ride. They continued up the mountain together, an uneasy procession of horses and riders, moving through forests that did not care about any of them. Clara rode at the front with Wyatt and the judge. Mercer and his men followed behind, and the trail was narrow enough that the two groups could not ride abreast, which meant Mercer spent the entire ascent staring at the back of a 24-year-old woman who had not so much as glanced at him since the trail. It took 2 hours. By the time they reached the Hadley clearing, the sun was high and the mountain was bathed in the hard, clean light of an autumn morning that made every detail sharp enough to cut. Silas was on the porch. He had not slept. His eyes were red-rimmed and his jaw was shadowed with stubble, and his rifle was across his knees. He had spent the night listening for hooves, for gunshots, for any sound that would tell him Clara was coming back or Clara was not coming back. The worst night of his life, and he had lived through Chickamauga. When he saw her ride into the clearing, something happened in his face that Boone, watching from the window, had not seen in 20 years. The stone broke, just for a second, just long enough for the man underneath to show through. Then it was back, the mask, the control, the face of a soldier who had learned to seal his feelings behind reinforced walls. But Clara saw it, that 1 second, and it told her everything she needed to know. She dismounted and walked to the porch, not to Silas, past him, into the cabin. She emerged with a chair which she set in the clearing. Then she went back for the table, the rough plank table where they ate their meals, and she carried it out by herself and placed it in front of the chair. "Judge Barrow," she said, "if you would." The old judge dismounted with the help of Wyatt's arm and walked to the table with his leather case. He sat down, opened the case, and arranged the documents with the practiced airman of a man who understood that law was not just words on paper, but the ritual of authority, and rituals required a setting. "Mr. Mercer," Barrow said, "please join us." Mercer dismounted. Thomas followed. The 10 riders remained on their horses, spread across the edge of the clearing like a wall. Silas stood up from his chair. Boone appeared in the doorway, shotgun in hand, his scarred face impassive. Wyatt leaned against the porch rail with his rifle and his grin and his absolute willingness to use either one. They faced each other in the morning light. On one side, Mercer Thomas, a New York lawyer, 10 hired men. On the other, Silas Boone, Wyatt, Clara, and a 72-year-old retired judge who was possibly the only honest man left in the county. Mercer spoke first. His voice was smooth, modulated, the voice of a man accustomed to boardrooms and negotiations. "I appreciate the formality, Judge Barrow, but this matter is straightforward. The Mercer Timber Company holds legal logging rights to the Blue Ridge Quarter, including this property. The deadline for voluntary sale expires today. My offer stands at 10 times market value. I believe that is more than generous." He turned to Clara, not to Silas, to Clara, because Thomas had briefed him, had explained that the wife was educated, had suggested that she might be the pragmatic voice in a household of stubborn men. "Mrs. Hadley," Mercer said, "you're a woman of intelligence. You know what life on this mountain means. Hard winters, isolation, no school for your children, no doctor within a day's ride, no society, no culture, nothing but trees and stone, and the slow, grinding work of survival." He gestured at the cabin, the clearing, the mountain rising behind it. "I'm offering your husband enough money to buy a proper farm in the valley, a house with a real floor, a life that doesn't require this kind of sacrifice." Clara stood between the porch and the table. She was still wearing the clothes she had ridden in all night, mud-stained, and wrinkled, her hair loose around her face because she had lost the pins somewhere on the night trail. She looked nothing like the woman who had arrived on a mule 4 months ago. That woman had been clean and frightened and holding on to the last shreds of a life she was already leaving. This woman was dirty and exhausted, and standing on ground she would die to defend. "Mr. Mercer," Clara said. Her voice carried across the clearing, the way a bell carries across a valley, clear and resonant and impossible to ignore. "I know exactly what life on this mountain means. I know because I've lived it. 4 months ago, I couldn't cook on an open fire, couldn't swing an axe, couldn't ride a horse down a trail without someone leading the way. I was a book printer's daughter from Boston who had never slept a night without a locked door between me and the world." She took a step forward, not toward Mercer, toward the center of the clearing where the light was strongest and every face could see hers. "You say there's no culture here. I've learned to tan leather and stitch it into things that keep people alive through winter. That's culture. You say there's no society. The three men standing behind me have taught me more about loyalty and honor and what it means to keep your word than every drawing room in Boston combined. That's society. Another step. Her voice did not waver. Her eyes did not leave Mercer's face. You asked Thomas Greer to investigate me. He told you about Edwin Price, about the marriage I ran from, about the man who thinks he bought a bride. Something shifted in the clearing. Thomas stiffened. Mercer's mask did not change, but Clara saw the flicker behind his eyes, the slight adjustment of a man who realized his leverage was about to be taken from him. So let me save you the trouble of using it, Clara said. You want to write to Edwin Price, right? Tell him Clara Whitfield is on a mountain in North Carolina. Tell him where to find her. She paused. Let the words settle. Let Mercer and Thomas and every man in that clearing hear what she was about to say. But tell him this too. The girl he wanted to buy doesn't exist anymore. Clara Whitfield was afraid of loud noises and empty rooms and men who raised their voices. Clara Hadley can shoot a rifle ride a horse through darkness down a mountain trail and look 10 armed men in the eye without flinching. As your man Thomas already discovered, if Edwin Price wants to come for me, he's welcome to try. I'll be waiting on this porch, and I won't be alone. Something cracked in the silence. Not a sound, but a feeling. The feeling of a man's plans collapsing. Thomas Greer looked at his employer with the expression of a chess player who has just realized his queen is trapped. Judge Barrow cleared his throat. If we're finished with the personal matters, I'd like to address the legal ones. He spread the deed on the table. The paper was yellowed fragile, but the ink was clear and the seal was unmistakable. This is the original land deed for the Hadley property, dated 1842, registered with the Western District Court of North Carolina under Judge Marcus Whitley. 800 acres purchased legally recorded, legally held by the Hadley family continuously since acquisition. He looked at Mercer's lawyer, a thin man with sharp eyes who had been silent until now. The Mercer Timber Company's logging rights were acquired under the Reconstruction Land Redistribution Act of 1870. Section 4, paragraph 12 of that act explicitly excludes privately held land deeded before 1860 from redistribution or eminent domain claims. Barrow tapped the deed. This property predates the cutoff by 18 years. Your client has no claim, no legal standing, no basis for acquisition, voluntary or otherwise. The lawyer stepped forward and examined the deed. He took his time, read every line, checked the seal, ran his finger along the signature. Then he straightened up and turned to Mercer. It's valid, he said. 2 words that cost Franklin Mercer 800 acres of prime timber and the satisfaction of having conquered the entire Blue Ridge corridor. For the first time, Mercer's mask cracked. Not dramatically, not the way a lesser man's composure would break. Just a tightening around the eyes, a whitening of the knuckles, a barely perceptible clench of the jaw. The crack of a man who was not accustomed to losing and was already calculating whether losing today meant losing forever. This isn't over, Mercer said. His voice was quiet, controlled. The kind of quiet that carries further than shouting because it makes the listener lean in to hear the threat. I'll find another way. I always do. Silas stepped off the porch. He had been silent through all of it, through Clara's speech and the judge's legal argument and the lawyer's reluctant admission. He had stood on his porch with his rifle and his brother and his friend and watched his wife do what he could not have done. Not because he lacked the courage, because the weapon Clara wielded the law required a precision he had never been trained for. His weapons were different, and now it was time to use them. He walked to where Mercer stood, close enough that Mercer had to look up to meet his eyes because Silas Hadley was 6'4" and Franklin Mercer was 5'10", and on this mountain, that difference was more than physical. Try, Silas said, 1 word. The way a mountain says 1 word when the wind asks permission to cross. Boone came down the porch steps. Slowly because his ribs were still healing, but he came and stood beside his brother. And Wyatt came down from his lean against the rail and stood on the other side. And Clara moved to stand beside Silas, her shoulder touching his arm, the top of her head barely reaching his chin, and it did not matter that she was the smallest person in the clearing, because at that moment she was the tallest. 4 people and a 72-year-old judge with a leather case and a lifetime of refusing to be bought standing against a timber baron, in his money and his men, in his absolute certainty that everything could be purchased. Mercer looked at them, looked at the mountain behind them, looked at the cabin and the clearing and the stumps and the garden and the grave markers on the hillside that he had not noticed before, but that told him more clearly than any deed that this land held the bones of the family that stood before him. He turned his horse. He did not speak again. Thomas followed, and the lawyer followed, and the 10 riders followed, and they rode down the mountain in a line growing smaller with each switchback of the trail until the forest swallowed them, and the clearing was empty, and the Blue Ridge was quiet in the way it was always quiet after something large had passed through. Nobody moved for a full minute. Then Boone sat down on the porch steps because his ribs could not take another second of standing, and Wyatt let out a breath that sounded like it had been held since dawn, and Judge Barrow began carefully returning the deed to his leather case with the satisfied deliberation of a man who had done a good thing and knew it. Silas looked at Clara. She looked at him. They stood 3 feet apart in the clearing where they had been married, where she had arrived on a borrowed mule with a newspaper clipping in her pocket and no idea what she was walking into. The woman who stood here now bore almost no resemblance to the one who had arrived, and the man who looked at her was not the same man either. He was still the 6'4" soldier who had survived Chickamauga and 20 years of solitude. But something in him had shifted the way bedrock shifts after enough water finds its way through, and what lay beneath the surface was warmer and more alive than he had allowed himself to remember. "You didn't come home," he said. His voice was rough, not with anger, with something else. "You went to Ashford instead." "Yes." "You rode the night trail, in the dark, alone with Wyatt." "Yes." "That trail has killed people, Clara. Experienced riders. In daylight." "I know." Silas was quiet for a moment. The muscle in his jaw worked. Then he said very quietly, "Don't ever do that to me again." Clara heard what the words meant. Not, "You disobeyed me." Not, "You took a risk I didn't authorize." Well, what she heard was, "I spent 12 hours not knowing if you were alive, and it almost broke me." "I had to," she said. "You know I had to." "I know," he exhaled, a long, slow release like pressure leaving a wound. "And it was the right call, a better call than mine would have been." He reached out, not fast, slow, the way you reach for something you are afraid to touch because touching it makes it real, and real things can be taken away. His hand found hers, rough fingers closing around rough fingers, 2 sets of calluses interlocking like they were made for each other. "Don't ever do that to me again," he repeated. But this time he was almost smiling. And Clara, who had ridden through darkness and faced down a timber baron and spoken her own name like a weapon, felt her eyes burn with tears. She had not cried since the night she left Boston. "I'll try," she said, "but I'm not making promises I can't keep." Silas pulled her closer, not gently, not carefully. The way a man holds something he almost lost with both arms and all his strength, and the full desperate weight of knowing how close the absence came. Clara pressed her face against his chest and breathed in the smell of him, wood smoke and pine, and the iron tang of a man who had stayed awake all night with a rifle on his knees, waiting for a woman who might never come back. Boone looked away. Not because the moment was private, though it was, because his eyes were wet and Boone Hadley had a reputation to maintain. Wyatt did not look away. He watched them with the expression of a man who had been waiting 15 years to see his brother hold another person, and the wait had been worth every second. The days after Mercer's departure settled over the mountain like the first real cold of winter, sharp and clarifying. The threat was not gone. Men like Mercer did not disappear. They retreated, regrouped, found new angles. But the immediate danger had passed, and in its place came a quiet that felt different from the quiet of before. Not empty, full. The fullness of people who had fought together and won together and now had to figure out what peace looked like. Judge Barrow filed the deed with the state registrar before leaving Ashford. He also filed a formal complaint against the Ashford sheriff for accepting bribes from the Mercer Timber Company. The complaint made its way up through the channels of bureaucracy with the slow inevitability of water finding its level, and by January the sheriff had been relieved of his duties and replaced by a man who was older, less corruptible, and not impressed by New York money. Barrow also sent a letter to Boston, not to Edwin Price, to the state court. A formal notification that Clara Whitfield had entered into a legal marriage in the state of North Carolina recorded and witnessed, and that any prior claims or arrangements regarding her person were dissolved by law. The letter was precise, technical, and devastating. Edwin Price received a copy. He did not write back. He did not come. Some men, when faced with the reality that the thing they wanted had become the thing they feared, simply turned their attention elsewhere. Edwin Price was such a man. He found another bride within 6 months, and Clara never heard his name again. The cabin was repaired. Boone's ribs healed slowly the way all things healed on a mountain, with time and stubbornness and the refusal to stay down. The barn was rebuilt larger than before with help from 3 families in the valley who had heard what the Hadleys had done and decided that anyone who stood up to a timber company deserved a new barn. And Clara began to build. Not a barn, not a fence. Something else entirely. Something that had been growing inside her since the first day Boone put a piece of leather in her hands and showed her how to make it yield. She set up a workstation in the cabin's main room near the window where the light was best. She ordered tools from Ashford, heavy needles, and wax thread, and a leather punch that Silas watched her use with the same focused intensity she had once applied to silk and satin, in a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. She tanned hides with Boone's guidance, selecting the best skins from their hunts, working them until they were supple enough to sew, but strong enough to last years. And she made things. Gloves that fit like skin and lasted like iron. Riding coats with stitching so precise the seams were waterproof. Holsters and sheaths and saddlebags with tooled patterns that turned functional objects into works of art. And boots. Boots that women could wear on a mountain and feel like they could conquer it, because Clara had learned that the difference between surviving a mountain and owning it started with what you put on your feet. She was not making delicate things. She was not making pretty things. She was making things that worked, things that protected, things that took the punishment a mountain could give and came back stronger for it. Word spread the way it always spread in the mountains, slowly through word of mouth and chance encounters at trading posts, and the particular admiration that rural people had for craftsmanship done right. A woman in Asheville ordered a pair of riding gloves after seeing Clara's work on a neighbor who had come down from the ridge. A merchant in Charlotte wrote asking about wholesale orders. A woman from Richmond visiting relatives in the area commissioned a custom riding coat and wept when she put it on because she said it made her feel like she could do anything. Clara did not have a name for what she was building. Not yet. But she knew what it was. It was the thing she had been looking for all her life without knowing it existed. The intersection of beauty and strength. The place where the skills she had brought from Boston met the woman she had become on the mountain. Silk and steel, precision and power. One evening, months after Mercer's retreat, Clara sat by the fire working on a leather vest that a rancher's wife from the valley had commissioned. Silas was at the table cleaning his rifle with the ritual attention he gave to everything that kept his family alive. Boone was writing in his journal. Wyatt was stretched on the floor with his hat over his face, either sleeping or pretending to. The cabin was warm. The fire crackled. Outside, snow had begun to fall. The first real snow of winter, and the mountain was going quiet the way it always went quiet when the white came down, as if the land itself was drawing a blanket over its shoulders. Silas set down his rifle, looked at Clara for a long time. Then he spoke, and his voice was different from any voice she had heard him use before. Not the flat soldier's voice, not the careful voice of a man guarding himself. Something underneath both of those. Something that had been buried for 20 years. There's something I haven't told you. Clara set down her needle. Boone stopped writing. Even Wyatt lifted the hat from his face. Silas stared at the fire, at the flames eating the wood, at the sparks rising upward like souls departing. I had a son. Before the war, his name was Samuel. He was 2 years old when I enlisted. A pause, the kind of pause that holds the weight of decades. When I came back, he was gone. Typhoid took him and his mother both. Winter of '63. The fire popped. Snow whispered against the window. They're buried on the hill behind the cabin. The 2 markers you've seen, the ones I never explained. Clara remembered she had noticed the markers in her first week. 2 stones set into the hillside shaded by a mountain oak. She had not asked about them because the mountain had taught her that some questions answered themselves when they were ready. I stopped sleeping inside for a year after that, Silas said. Slept on the porch, in the barn, on the ground, because the cabin felt like a coffin with them gone and me still breathing. His hands were still. His jaw was set the way it always was when he fought something he could not shoot. But his voice was breaking in places he could not reinforce fast enough. I lived alone for 20 years because I believed if I didn't love anything, I couldn't lose anything. If I kept the walls high enough and the distance far enough, then nothing could reach me and nothing could be taken. He looked at Clara, and every defense was gone. Just gone. What was left was a man, not a soldier, not a fortress, not the immovable thing he had built himself into. A man who had been carrying a weight for 2 decades and was finally painfully setting it down. Then you came, on a mule, in a white dress. Couldn't cook, couldn't ride, couldn't split a log to save your life. And I looked at you and I thought she won't last a week. A sound that might have been a laugh if it had more air in it. But you lasted. You lasted and you changed and you became this. This woman who rides through the dark and faces down men with rifles and makes things from leather that are stronger than anything I could build from wood. And I realized that 20 years of keeping everyone out hadn't protected me. It had just made me smaller. He reached across the space between their chairs. His hand found hers, the same gesture from the clearing, but different now, because now she knew what it cost him. You taught me something the mountain couldn't, he said, that being alone isn't brave. Sometimes brave is letting someone in close enough to hurt you. Clara held his hand, held it the way you hold something that has been broken and mended and is stronger at the seams than it ever was whole. I'm not going anywhere, she said. I know. His thumb traced the scars on her knuckles, the map of 4 months of transformation written on her skin. That's what terrifies me. And Clara understood that when Silas Hadley said terrifies, he did not mean fear. He meant the other thing, the thing that lived on the other side of every wall he had built. The thing he had been running from for 20 years, not because it was dangerous, but because it was vast, and vast things could swallow you whole if you let them. She leaned against him, put her head on his shoulder, a small gesture. Nothing dramatic. But Silas closed his eyes and Boone closed his journal, and Wyatt put his hat back over his face to hide whatever was happening on it, and the fire crackled, and the snow fell, and the mountain held them the way it had held the Hadley family for 3 generations, with patience, with silence, and with the understanding that the strongest things were not the ones that never broke, but the ones that broke and chose to mend. Spring came to Blue Ridge the way spring always came, slowly, reluctantly, as if the mountain had to be convinced that warmth was trustworthy. The snow melted in patches, revealing mud and new growth and the stubborn green of things that had survived the cold by going deep instead of staying visible. Clara stood on the porch on a morning in April, a year after she had arrived on a borrowed mule, with nothing but a newspaper clipping in desperation. In her hand she held a leather needle larger and heavier than any needle she had used in Boston, and a piece of deerskin she was shaping into a jacket for a woman in Asheville who had written to say she wanted something that makes me feel like I can stand in any storm and not bend. Clara knew exactly what that felt like. She was wearing it. Silas was below splitting wood with the same unhurried rhythm he brought to everything. The axe rose and fell, and the sound of it echoed across the clearing like a heartbeat. Boone sat on a stump nearby, writing in his journal, his scarred face tilted toward the sun in a way that Clara had learned meant he was at peace. The scar had not changed, but Boone had. He no longer turned away when people looked at him. Somewhere in the winter, between the firelight and Clara's steady gaze and the slow accumulation of being seen without being judged, he had stopped hiding the part of himself that he thought was ugly. Wyatt was training a new horse in the meadow beyond the barn. The animal was young and wild and doing everything in its power to throw him in. Wyatt was laughing, which meant he was either in control or enjoying the chaos. With Wyatt, it was usually both. A rider appeared on the trail below, not a threat. The mail carrier from Ashford, a boy of 16 who made the ride up the mountain twice a month and considered it the best job he had ever had because Mrs. Hadley always gave him cornbread for the trip back. He handed Clara a letter. She thanked him, gave him the cornbread, and watched him ride away before looking at the envelope. Boston, her mother's handwriting. Clara opened it, read it standing on the porch while the mountain waited and Silas's axe kept its rhythm below. The letter was short, her mother had heard. About the mountain, about the marriage, about the deed and the timber company and the woman her daughter had become. Margaret Whitfield did not approve. Margaret Whitfield did not understand. But Margaret Whitfield was in her careful, constrained, proper way, asking if she might visit. Clara folded the letter. Her face was still. She was thinking about the woman who had raised her, the woman who had taught her that virtue was silence and obedience and the ability to endure without complaint. The woman who had tried to sell her to a man with thin lips and dead eyes because that was what mothers did in that world, in that time when they had no other options. She did not hate her mother. She had carried anger for months, hot and righteous. But the mountain had done something to that anger the way it did something to everything. Worn it down, smoothed it, turned it from a sharp thing into a heavy thing, and finally into a thing she could set down. Silas looked up from his woodpile, saw her holding the letter. "What is it?" "My mother. She wants to come visit." Silas looked at the cabin, small, rough, handmade. A world away from anything Margaret Whitfield would recognize as civilized. Then he looked at Clara, and something that was almost a smile moved across his face. Almost, with Silas almost, was as close as you got, and Clara had learned to read the distance. "Tell her to bring boots that can handle a mountain," he said. Clara laughed, and the laugh broke something open in her chest, some last sealed chamber. And what came out was not grief or relief or joy, but all of them at once pouring through her like spring, melt through a canyon, unstoppable and clean. She sat down on the porch, picked up her needle, went back to the jacket she was making for a woman she had never met, who wanted to feel like she could stand in any storm. Clara knew how to make that jacket, because she had stood in the storm, had ridden through the dark, had held a rifle and a deed in a man's hand and her own ground, had been broken down to nothing and rebuilt from the bones out. The girl from Boston was gone. In her place was a woman who made armor from leather and love from silence, and a home from a mountain that had tried to kill her and failed. Before we go, let me ask you something. When was the last time you chose the hard thing instead of the easy one? When was the last time you stood your ground when everything around you was telling you to run? If this story meant something to you, hit that like button. It helps more than you might think. And if you know someone who is carrying something heavy in silence, someone who feels trapped in a life that doesn't fit anymore, share this with them. Sometimes a story is the nudge a person needs. Subscribe for more stories like this, and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I read every single one because here's the truth that Clara Hadley learned on a mountain in North Carolina in 1878, and it's the same truth that holds today 150 years later. Sometimes the thing we call safety is just a prison with comfortable furniture. And sometimes the thing we call wild is just freedom wearing a different face. Clara Whitfield was a virgin bride who was afraid of everything. Clara Hadley was a mountain woman who was afraid of nothing. They were the same person. The only difference was that one of them had been given permission to exist. Three men on a mountain didn't save her. They didn't rescue her or fix her or turn her into something she wasn't. They did something harder and rarer and more valuable than any of that. They stood back. They handed her the tools, and they trusted her to build herself. That's not a love story. That's something better. That's a story about becoming who you were always meant to be, and it is never too late to start.